In today's video, we'll be looking at Kronhauw. In addition to looking at my own take on the technique, we're also going to be looking at some of the interesting mechanics which arise from the Kronhauw itself. This is the description of the technique from the 1570 text. It looks fairly straightforward, so let's give it a try. We begin in a low guard, typically Plunge. As the opponent cuts in from above, we respond with a parry of our own with the cross guard, in the form of Kron. Having stopped the attack, we now cut in with the false edge of our own blade behind their sword. Once again from the front, low guard, catch with the Kron. There are some different variations on where the Kron should be, but we'll talk about this later. Now we plunge behind their blade, attacking their head with the false edge of our sword. It's worth noting that there are other ways to perform the Kronhauw. We can use a Zwerhauw-like attack here to the left side of our opponent's head. However, the text specifically says behind the blade, and usually, when Meyer refers to behind the blade, he then typically describes interposing your sword between your opponent's sword and their body, which is exactly what this version does. Finally, of course, we should talk about the controversy of what Kron is. I'm going with the simplest approach from Meyer here, with the horizontal crossguard. It can be central, off to the side, which is better, or you can go outside of Meyer and use the slightly tilted version, which is suggested in other texts. So it's simple. The Kronhauw is a simple parry with the crown, and then a riposte with the false edge. Isn't it? We're already told in earlier texts, as well as in Meyer itself, that the Kron is a risky technique to use. There are a few reasons for this. Firstly, with this parry-riposte type tempo, it's easy for them to attack over our blade, or disengage under, cutting to our arms. More importantly though, Meyer tells us himself that the Kronhauw is not performed in two actions. It's a single action which parries and counterattacks at the same time, just like a Zwerhauw or an Absetzen might. So if Kronhauw isn't a two-action movement, how do we perform it? The answer might lie in Meyer's 1568 text, which has a quite different description of the Kronhauw. This version of the Kronhauw uses an attacking action with the flat through the position of Kron, and as we unpack this, we begin to discover some interesting outcomes. Starting from the shoulder, our opponent cuts in at us. We counter with a cut of our own using the flat, sliding along their blade with the long edge and transitioning through the position of Kron, though not staying in it. From here we snap over with that same plunging action behind their blade, striking them to the head and ending in a position which is somewhat like Schildhauer, which, from the text, looks like this. Now from the front, cutting in with the flat, through Kron, plunging the blade behind to the head. Let's take a second to disassemble this and examine this cutting in action a little bit further. For a simple descending cut, there are three broad distances of cut that we can use. The first is very close, and typically arises from snapping actions or wrenching actions for very close range attacks. It has good structure and good coverage, but very short range. The second is more of a moderate intermediate cut. It has a greater range, an excellent structure, and very good cutting potential. This is kind of the default cut that most people use. There's also a third cut, which is an extended cut, which leaves the arms much straighter out and has greater range and a higher hand position. However, there are some sacrifices we make in this technique, which we'll examine shortly. It's interesting that in the context of Meyer's fencing, this extended position is very commonly used, and there are some very good reasons for this. Aside from the obvious range benefit, Meyer points out that he has the best with the cut who comes with his weapon above the opponents in cutting. Consider the situation where two fencers are cutting in at each other simultaneously. The fencer with the higher hand position in this situation is able to take the weak of the opponent's blade, thus displacing it effectively. We can see this from the front. In this case, the red blade is able to more easily suppress the opponent's blade downwards and take the center line. This is not without risk. Look how exposed the thumb is here. If two fencers are simultaneously cutting in with the same high cut, there's a good chance that eventually you're going to get hit on the hand doing these techniques. Luckily, the Kronhauw has already given us the solution. By cutting in with the flat, we form a V between the guard and the blade, effectively eliminating any risk of getting hit on the hand. Of course, this works with our standard default hand position as well as the extended cut. Here from the side, extended cut with the flat. An ancillary benefit of this is that in using the flat, we can actually flick our blade over our opponent's parry so that we can still hit them, even if they've tried to stop us. This is a completely legitimate fencing technique, and it shows up in Meyer's texts in several places. We can adapt this to modern fencing practice by using a thrust off of this instead of a cut. The flex of the blade bends around the opponent's inside parry as they perform it, while we're simultaneously protected by our own crossguard in the V position. So let's put this back into the practice of our Kronhauw. In this new version, we use an extended cut through the position of Kron using the flat. Engage the hip and extend, cutting over their blade, through Kron for protection and superior position. To complete the Kronhauw, we continue through into the plunge behind their blade. This is one smooth, continuous action. It's not a parry riposte, it's a single time counterattack with a form of opposition. Engage, cut flat through the Kron into the plunge. Looking at the Kronhauw and the other techniques we've considered, we begin to realize the truth of Meyer's observation that the principal cuts underlie all of the other techniques in his system. Variation arises through simple changes in blade alignment, as well as very minor tweaks to the mechanics of the cutting action itself. If we attack with the long edge directly, we're performing an Oberhauw. Using the flat, Kronhauw. Clashing across diagonally with the flat, it's a Glutzhauw. Coming down with a false edge, a Schielhauw, and using the false edge in a more descending action, it becomes a Zwerhauw. Returning to the 1570 version though, it doesn't begin with a cut. Instead, we'll replace the cutting mechanic with a thrusting mechanic from Flug. Here we thrust through Kron and then plunge over. Our two-step action is now one smooth continuous counterattack, which of course we can also adapt to use as a thrusting technique in opposition. So in summary, the key points of the Kronhauw are as follows. Regardless of whether we're starting high or low, we begin by engaging the hip and thrusting or cutting through the Kron guard using the flat. We turn the false edge against them behind their blade as we slide forward, and we simultaneously lift the hands up into a Schielhauw-like position to finish. This is a continuous motion forward throughout, so that the technique is a single counter-attacking action. And there you have it. Thanks for watching.